Hello everyone, and welcome to another recorded lecture of BIO101 online. And today we'll be discussing Chapter 2, the chemistry of life. So looking at this picture, we can see these penguins, the ice, the water, and the air are all forms of matter. And the matter that make up every object in this universe consists of one or more elements that are organized into atoms and molecules. So these words might seem new right now, but we'll define what an atom is, what matter is, what molecules are. But in this picture, everything here is made of matter, but not everything is alive. So try to use the concepts we learned in Chapter 1 to see if you can determine which of these objects are alive and which are made of matter. We said in last class that life is organized, and we could begin at the simplest level, which is the chemical level. So what we're going to do today in Chapter 2 is zoom in on the atomic level and the molecular level, which is the very basic level of organization of all living things. Chemistry is the scientific study of matter and how that matter interacts. And life is very fragile. And life depends on the proper functioning of millions of different chemical reactions functioning in trillions of cells at every second of every day of your life. So chemistry talks about how different chemical reactions proceed, and biology talks about how those chemical reactions enable living things to function. So regardless of whether you're alive or not, matter refers to anything that has mass and occupies space. So the air that we're breathing, the liquid that you drink, the lava that comes from a volcano, they're all made of matter. And matter exists in four states. There are three primary states, solid, liquid, and gas. Those are ones that you've heard before. Plasma is another category of matter, and that's very hard to find on Earth. You can see them in stars, right? Stars have plasma, and neon signs that you might see in a storefront have plasma inside. I'll explain what that is in a bit. But solids, gases, and liquids are the three primary states of matter. So you can think about a solid like the table that you're sitting at right now, gas that you're breathing in, and the liquid that you're drinking are all forms of matter. And here's a little more detail, talking about the structures of these different forms of matter and how the energy states vary as you go from a solid to a liquid to a gas and to a plasma. So you can take a look at this, pause the video here. So all matter is composed of elements. And an element cannot be broken down into any other substance by ordinary chemical means. It is a pure substance. So an element is pure. And an element, on Earth, there could be 92 different varieties or 92 different naturally occurring elements on planet Earth. You might have heard of some like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. So these, again, cannot be broken down very easily. And despite there being 92 naturally occurring elements on our planet, only 6 elements make up 95% of the body weight of living organisms. In order to remember this easily, you could remember the mnemonic CHNOPS, and that stands for carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So those are the major elements that make up living organisms. There's an interesting picture in the book, actually, on page 20, that talks about the different percentages of elements in the Earth's crust versus in organisms. So an atom is the smallest part of an element. And an element and an atom of that element share the same name. So for example, a carbon atom is the smallest part of the element carbon. Atoms are composed of subatomic particles, right? Subatomic means, beneath or less than atomic. So subatomic particles we'll talk about are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons have a positive charge. Neutrons have no charge. Electrons are negatively charged. And we have, while protons and neutrons both have a mass unit of 1, those are arbitrary numbers, electrons are so light that they don't have any mass at all. Their mass is negligible. This is a structure of how we can draw an atom, and protons and neutrons are located in the nucleus of an atom. Do not confuse this with the cell's nucleus that can contain DNA in eukaryotes. So the nucleus in an atom consists of protons and neutrons. The nucleus of a cell consists of DNA. Two separate things. So in chemistry, we refer to the nucleus of an atom referring to the protons and neutrons. The electrons are not in the nucleus. The electrons orbit, so they spin around the nucleus in shells. So there are specific levels that the electrons can orbit around the nucleus in. We call those shells. So to summarize, we said that protons have a positive 1 charge and an atomic mass of 1. Neutrons have an atomic mass of 1, but they're neutral. You can remember neutrons are neutral, where protons are positive. Electrons have a negative 1 charge, but do not have a mass. I believe electrons are about 20,000 times lighter than a proton. Some other fun facts that are pretty hard to imagine. There are more atoms in a single grain of sand than grains of sand on planet Earth. So just imagine, if you take one little grain of sand, there are more atoms in that one grain of sand than there are in grains of sand at all the deserts on planet Earth. That's how small atoms are. And if you were to visualize Gillette Stadium as one big atom, a little marble would represent the nucleus, and you could place that right in the very center of the field. And if you want to draw the electrons, they're proportional to, they would be in the farthest seating. All the way up here, the electrons would be, and the marble would represent the nucleus right in the middle of the stadium. So again, try to visualize that. So the protons and neutrons are a little marble in the middle of the stadium, and the electrons are all the way out here orbiting faster than we could imagine. And that raises an interesting question. What's in between the protons and neutrons and the electrons? If there's so much space, right? That's all one atom. And the truth is, most of matter is empty space. And this can get a little philosophical, but most of what we see is empty space. And without going into too much detail, it's the speed of electrons. Because they orbit so fast, despite atoms being mostly space, they appear as a solid. That's all I'll say about that for now. But these are things to keep in mind. So each element has a unique chemical symbol. There's a letter for each one. It could be 1 or 2 letters. So H is hydrogen, Na is sodium, C is carbon. Each element also has an atomic number. And the atomic number is the number of protons in each atom of an element. So remember, every atom has a nucleus. Within that nucleus, there's a certain number of protons. The atomic number defines each element. Each element has a specific atomic number, a specific number of protons. The mass number of an element is equal to the mass of an atom's protons and neutrons together. And remember, a proton and neutrons are each one atomic mass unit. So the mass number is equal to the number of protons plus neutrons. You can also think of the mass number as the mass of the nucleus. What's inside the nucleus? So let's look at this example of helium. That was actually the atom we saw on the previous page. This is a helium atom because it has 2 protons and 2 neutrons and 2 electrons. So now looking back, we can look at this little card, here's helium. The symbol is He. The atomic number is 2. So that means there are 2 protons in each atom of helium. The mass is 4. So how many neutrons does helium have? Right, you should say 2. Because if the atomic mass or the mass number, and again, mass number and atomic mass will be used interchangeably in this class. I'll talk about that in a bit. But if you want to figure out the number of neutrons, you would subtract. You would take the atomic mass minus the atomic number equals number of neutrons. Right? Because the atomic mass is protons plus neutrons, and the atomic number is just protons. So atomic mass minus atomic number equals the number of neutrons. Isotopes are atoms of the same element that differ in the number of neutrons. So these are elements that have the same number of protons, but different number of neutrons. So while they have the same atomic number, they have different mass numbers. And now I'm just going to distinguish atomic mass and mass numbers. So the atomic mass of an atom refers to the average mass for all of the isotopes of that atom. So what that means is there are many different isotopes of an element found on Earth. So for example, carbon, normally, most of the carbon on our planet has a mass number of 12, meaning it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. However, there are different varieties of carbon found on planet Earth. There are some versions of carbon that have 7 neutrons. So the atomic mass would be, the mass number would be 13. There are some versions that have 8 neutrons. So that mass number would be carbon 14. Since carbon 12 is the most abundant, the atomic mass takes that into consideration, and it averages out all the different masses of the isotopes of a certain atom. So it takes into account all the carbon 12, all the carbon 13, all the carbon 14, etc., and it averages it out, and the atomic mass of carbon is 12.01 atomic mass units. So the atomic mass, it's a little higher than the mass number because there are other isotopes of carbon that weigh a little more because they have more neutrons. Again, for this class, atomic mass and mass number are used interchangeably. So what are the numbers next to each carbon atom below? You should be able to tell me what each number represents. Right? The lower number is the atomic number, meaning it's the number of protons. And carbon, no matter if you're carbon, you have 6 protons. If you have 7 protons, you're not carbon anymore. You're nitrogen. So carbon always has 6 protons, but depending on the isotope, these are 3 different isotopes of carbon that have different numbers of neutrons. So pause the video right now and tell me how many neutrons there are in each of these isotopes of carbon. So there are 6 here, 7 neutrons here, and 8 neutrons here. Some isotopes of an element can be unstable, some of which are radioactive. And a radioisotope is a radioactive isotope that releases energy as it decays. So basically what that means is it's an atom might be unstable if it's an isotope. So it gives off energy as it breaks down into a more stable form. And as it breaks down into smaller particles, it releases radiation. And that can be harmful or helpful. So we can use some radioactive isotopes at low levels to help diagnose disease. So in medicine, we could use iodine, radioactive iodine 131, and you can look at the thyroid, and that's the only organ that can take up this radioactive iodine. And you could look at an image under a PET scan of the thyroid, And you can see whether it's healthy in structure and function. So that the thyroid gland is right by the trachea, and you can see the iodine only goes to the trachea. And since it releases energy, you can pick that up on an imaging technique like a PET scan, right? Positron emission tomography. So it's looking at the release of radioactivity from the radioactive iodine that's being taken up in the thyroid. You can also use an MRI to look at the brain. So you could use radioactive, you could use a PET scan as well. You use radioactive glucose, and you could inject that into the body. And tissues always need to use glucose in order to function properly. So you can look at the brain, for example, and see which parts of the brain are properly utilizing that glucose. And the regions of the brain that are not utilizing that radioactive glucose might be damaged. You can use high levels of radiation on produce. So these peaches up here were picked from a tree, and a few days later, they just started to rot because they naturally have fungi and bacteria on them that are going to just start eating away and causing that to decay. Most of the food that you eat from the supermarket has been irradiated using high levels of radiation after it's been picked. So it lasts longer in the supermarket and in your fruit bowl. So you might notice sometimes that organic produce doesn't last as long, and this is exactly why. So organic produce is not irradiated, and that's why it lasts a shorter period of time, normally when it's on your countertop. There's no known harmful side effect of radiation. When you're eating the fruit, there's no active energy that can do anything to your DNA. However, you can use high levels of radiation to selectively kill cells. Specifically, you might want to use high levels of radiation to target a tumor cell. And some types of tumors, like a glioblastoma in the brain, might be very hard to surgically remove because it might compromise other vital structures of the brain. So you could use very high precision, like beams of radiation, to selectively kill tumor cells in hard to reach places. So take a second to figure out which of these numbers represents the mass number, which is the atomic number, and which is the atomic symbol. So the mass number is 3, the atomic number is here, number 1, 6, and the atomic symbol is C. The periodic table of elements is what displays all of the known elements on Earth, and some of which that were created in a lab years after the natural ones were discovered. We call the rows of the periodic table periods. So each row is a period. Each column is called a group. And in a period, so in these rows, elements are arranged in increasing atomic number. So this means as you go from left to right, we increase in number of protons, and we increase in the size of the atoms. And interestingly, atoms within the same group, so each column, share very similar chemical characteristics. So all of these gases, these are all called noble gases. They're very, very stable. They all act very similarly in this column. These, in this column over here, in this group, these metals all act very similarly. So this was a very hard feat to do, to organize all the elements found on Earth according to their properties and size. Was developed by a Russian chemist, Dmitry Mendeleev, and he was able to basically group all the elements based on multiple different properties to make it easier for us to understand how different atoms relate to each other in properties and in their size. No atom on the periodic table is charged. What that means is, let's look at this nitrogen atom over here with an atomic number of 7. That means it has 7 protons. Since nitrogen is not charged, it has a charge of 0, if there are 7 protons, how many electrons would there be? Right? So if there are 7 positively charged protons, there must be 7 negatively charged electrons. Right? So when you're looking at a neutral atom or an element, the atomic number is the number of protons, as we know, but it's also the number of electrons, since all of these are neutral. They're electrically neutral. So here's a portion of the periodic table. You can see the atomic number, the atomic symbol, and the atomic mass is shown over here. And the periods are the rows, the groups are the columns. Electrons are what determine the chemical behavior of atoms. And electrons have energy due to their distance from the nucleus. So we said electrons revolve around the nucleus in shells called orbitals. And each orbital represents a different energy level. When you take organic chemistry or a chemistry class, we'll talk a lot more about these orbitals and these energy levels. But right now, I want you to understand that each electron has a specific position, and you can predict which position this electron is in. And there are different shells that each electron can occupy. We'll talk about this in the next few slides. So this is the rule. There's a rule for how electrons are distributed. So electrons occupy orbitals according to the octet rule. This might be a little tricky at first, but I'm not going to require you to know too much detail about the octet rule. I just want you to know this. For atoms with atomic numbers of 20 or less, the first energy shell can hold up to 2 electrons. Each additional shell can hold up to 8 electrons. And each lower shell must be filled before electrons can occupy the next shell. The outermost electrons of an atom are called valence electrons. Valence electrons. And the octet rule states that the outermost shell is most stable when it is full. Meaning, the octet rule says when the outermost shell has 8 electrons, right? That's what octet. Oct means 8. When the outermost shell has 8 electrons, that's when it's most stable. So the valence electrons kind of determine the stability of an atom. There's an exception because hydrogen and helium have complete valence shells with 2 electrons because they don't have enough electrons to fill a second shell to begin with. So like I was saying, the valence electrons determine the chemical reactivity and the stability of these atoms, and unpaired valence electrons form bonds with other unpaired valence electrons to become more stable. This is the secret of chemistry. Atoms like to interact with each other to become more stable. So the valence electrons determine the chemical properties of that atom. So whether you look at helium versus air, they have very different properties. Those properties could be explained by the electrons of helium versus those in carbon dioxide, which is carbon and oxygen. You could explain the difference of charcoal, which is carbon, and gold, which is a different element, Au. Right, these are all due to the valence electrons. Right, the valence electrons determine the chemical properties of atoms and how they'll interact with each other. So these are models of atoms of how we draw the electrons. So let's take carbon for example. Carbon has an atomic number of 6, which means 6 protons. That also means it has 6 electrons. So we could start by drawing this circle that represents the nucleus. So in this nucleus, we have 6 protons and 6 neutrons in here. And since, again, there are 6 protons, there are 6 electrons. So how do we start drawing the electrons? We start by drawing a shell, and we know the first shell can hold 2 electrons. So we can draw 1, 2. How many more electrons do we have? 4. So the remaining 4 electrons can go in the outermost shell. Now ask yourself, how many more electrons can carbon have in its outermost shell? It can have 4 more electrons, right? It wants to have a total of 8 electrons in its outermost shell. So carbon, just like this, is not very happy. It does not have an outer shell of 8. So we're going to see what that means for carbon. You could use that example for phosphorus, which has 15 electrons. So the first shell has 2. The second shell has 8, so that could be a full shell. But how many more do we have left after the first 2 shells? We still have 5 more electrons. So the third shell will have the last 5, and those are the valence electrons. So a phosphorus atom has 5 valence electrons. I want to go back to the periodic table just to show you a little trick. The group number tells you how many valence electrons there are. So carbon, we said, had 4 valence electrons, and it's in group 4. We then looked at phosphorus, which had 5 valence electrons, and is in group 5. So this is another really genius way that the periodic table is organized. And you can see that these noble gases are very stable because they're in group 8, meaning they have 8 valence electrons. So now's a good time to stop before we go on to the next section of molecules and compounds. So a molecule is multiple atoms bonded together. So examples can be NaCl, which is a sodium and a chlorine, so salt, sodium chloride, or it could be oxygen, O2. If a molecule contains atoms of different elements, we call it a compound. So for example, glucose has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So it's not only a molecule, it's a compound. Whereas a molecule that's not a compound would be like oxygen. Right? Oxygen is a pure molecule because it's only made of one type of element, only oxygen. Same thing with helium. So helium and oxygen are both elements they come in molecular form, but a compound would be like water, which has hydrogen and oxygen. So all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules, like oxygen, are compounds. And a chemical formula tells us the number of each kinds of atoms in a single molecule. So this specific molecule is a compound because it has 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms per molecule. So you have to try to visualize this, right? One molecule has many, many atoms, right? Remember, the atoms are the basics, like the basic level, and then those get built up into molecules. So pause the video here and see if you can answer this question. So the answer is there are 6 oxygen atoms in each glucose molecule. How many atoms are there in each glucose molecule? So pause here. The answer is D, 24. Right, there's 6 plus 12 plus 6 atoms. Overall, there are 24 atoms in each glucose molecule. So now we can start talking about chemical bonding. And it's important to note that bonds between atoms contain energy. So what we're doing is we're kind of storing energy. We're trying to connect electrons in a way. We're moving electrons around in order to transfer energy or store energy. And we'll talk about 4 major types of bonds in this class. We'll talk about ionic bonds, polar covalent, nonpolar covalent, and hydrogen bonds. There are other types, but those are the 4 we'll talk about in this class. And a chemical reaction is a fancy way to say bonds are being made or broken. So the process of bond formation and bond rearrangement is a chemical reaction. So that's what a chemist does, right? A chemist studies how bonds get rearranged and made and broken between molecules. Let's start by talking about ionic bonds. So an ion is an atom that has lost or gained an electron. So ions can form ionic bonds. And an ionic bond forms when electrons are transferred from one atom to another. So salts are solid substances that usually separate and dissolve as individual ions in water. So sodium chloride, NaCl, is normally a solid substance at room temperature when it's dry. And when you put that in water, the Na and the Cl ions both separate. And the sodium has a plus charge, has a positive 1 charge, and the chloride has a minus 1 charge. So we don't call these atoms anymore. We call them ions because they have a charge associated to them. And these ions are normally held together as NaCl by an ionic bond. So ionic bonds are great and they're very strong, but once they're in water, once you take this NaCl and you put it in water, the ionic bond is broken and you just get ions. So zooming into salts, we can see they're actually an arrangement of many, many chloride ions and sodium ions in a specific structure. And when you dissolve this in water, the ionic bonds that normally keep the sodium and chloride together become dispersed. Those ionic bonds get broken because the water kinds of shields each ion from interacting with each other. And this will make a little more sense after we discuss water and the properties of water. So, how do ions form? Let's remember the octet rule first. And let's look at this sodium atom. So sodium, you could look at the periodic table, has an atomic number of 11. So that means it has 11 protons and 11 electrons. So let's start by drawing an atom of sodium. We start, the first shell has 2, so 1, 2. The second shell can hold up to 8. Right, so this is actually a full shell. So how many do we have left? We have so far 10 put in. We still have one more to put. So this third shell has only 1 electron in it. Remember the octet rule. The octet rule says atoms are most stable when they have only 8 electrons in their outermost shell. So sodium, when it's neutral, is not a very happy atom because it has this measly little electron in its outermost shell. Chlorine, on the other hand, so chlorine is the neutral form, and chlorine has an atomic number of 17. So we'll put 2, and then the next can have 8 electrons. That gives us a total of 10. The third shell would have to hold the remaining 7 electrons. Again, recalling the octet rule, we know the outermost electrons want to have 8. So this chlorine is not very happy either. So sodium over here and chlorine over here see each other and they say, we can make a deal. This chlorine would love nothing more than to accept this electron because that would give it a full octet and it would make it very stable. This sodium is down for the deal because it would get rid of this electron and that would give it its full octet and the sodium would be stable. So sure enough, sodium says, here, chlorine, take my electron. And when that happens, sodium becomes positively charged because now it has 11 protons, but only 10 electrons. It gave electron away. And conversely, chlorine became negatively charged because it just accepted an extra electron. Right? So now it has 18 electrons and only 17 protons. So just like a magnet, a positive and a negative charge will be attracted to each other, And these two ions become locked in place. They form an ionic bond. So these two ions stick together so tightly because this is positively charged. This is a positively charged sodium ion, and this is a negatively charged chloride ion. So we say chloride instead of chlorine when it's a negative ion. So a chloride ion is Cl minus. And together, this is sodium chloride molecule. This is salt. So this is shown right over here. So of course you have a specific arrangement. It's a crystal lattice structure of sodium chloride. But once you dissolve this in water, these bonds break. The ionic bond is broken. And you're going to have just Na plus and Cl minus dissociated, meaning they're separated in the water solution. So that's ionic bonding. So, and again, ionic bonding, you remember transfer of electrons. Ionic bonds happen when electrons are transferred from one atom to another, and that's the ionic bond. So electrons are being transferred. Covalent bonds result when two atoms share electrons. So each atom can then have a full shell of valence electrons. So again, bonds are just trying to get atoms more stable. That's why bonds are being formed. Atoms want to reach a better level of stability. So instead of transferring an electron, like in an ionic bond, covalent bonds result when two atoms share electrons. There are two flavors of covalent bond. There's a nonpolar covalent bond and a polar covalent bond. This is sometimes tricky for students, but we'll walk through it slowly. So in a nonpolar covalent bond, electrons are shared equally between atoms. So nonpolar means equal in this case. In a polar covalent bond, electrons are shared unequally. So polar means unequal. So these are examples of covalently bonded molecules. So let's take an example of carbon. Carbon has 6 protons. It has an atomic number of 6, and it has 6 electrons. So if we were to draw out carbon, I'm going to do that right here. So here's our carbon atom. The first shell has 2 electrons, and the outer shell has 4. 2, 3, 4. And I'll just make that the first shell, and then this is the second shell. And now, remembering the octet rule, it's a terrible circle, but I think you get the idea. These are 4 valence electrons. How many more electrons does carbon want to have to be stable? It wants to have 8 total. So this wants to have 4 more electrons. So let's take a very simple example as methane, which is CH4. It's carbon with 4 hydrogens. Why 4 hydrogens? Because each hydrogen has 1 electron. So if this hydrogen comes close to this carbon, they can share this 1 electron. And this carbon can share this 1 electron. So when the carbon and the hydrogen share a pair of electrons, that's a covalent bond. It's a handshake, right? This carbon is putting one hand out, this hydrogen is putting another hand out, shaking hands, and that is also drawn as a straight line between the carbon and the hydrogen. So this straight line right here is the same thing as 2 electrons being shared. So each line connecting 2 atoms represents 2 atoms being shared. So we're going to have not only 1 hydrogen atom, but we're going to have a total of 4. Because then, right, there's another one, there's another one. Then we're going to have the happiest carbon because it will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons. So this explains why methane is so stable. CH4. All right, remember, all atoms are trying to follow the octet rule. There can be not only single covalent bonds, but double covalent bonds. So the oxygen we breathe is not just one oxygen. And you can think about why that is. Oxygen has an atomic number of 8. So if you were to draw oxygen, it would have 6 valence electrons. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is not very happy. So in fact, what oxygen does is it shares 2 pairs of electrons with another oxygen. That allows each oxygen to have an octet. So you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then this oxygen has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And since these are 2 pairs of electrons, we draw them as 2 lines. So oxygen gas that we breathe in is actually O2. And it's 2 oxygens that are doubly bound to each other. So it's 2 double bonds. So that's how we would draw double bonds. That's how we draw single bonds. Try to draw ammonia, NH4, on your own. So how you would start is look at a periodic table to look for the atomic number of nitrogen, the N. Then use that information to figure out how many electrons there would be in a nitrogen atom. And use the rules, the octet rule, to draw the electron shells around nitrogen. And then figure out where other hydrogen atoms would want to go in order to follow the octet rule. So you can watch this brief video to talk about ionic bonding versus covalent bonding. So here's a different example of an ionic bond. Right? Here we have the full octet. Right? These are ions. So covalent. We have 8 here and 8 on the other fluorine. Great. So now we said that there are actually 2 flavors of covalent bonds. There are either polar covalent bonds or non-polar covalent bonds. And we'll talk about covalent bonds, polar covalent bonds first, that are shared unequally like water. And there's a very important concept that we have to understand before we could talk about polar and non-polar covalent bonds. And that concept is electronegativity. Every atom has a specific electronegativity, which means is the ability of an atom to attract electrons toward itself in a chemical bond. So each atom has a greediness for electrons. Normally, bigger atoms have more electronegativity, meaning they have more of a desire for atoms. So if you have a very large atom bonded to a very small atom, that large atom will pull on the electrons a lot harder. It's a lot more electronegative. So Electronegativity, again, measures an atom's ability to attract electrons, and electronegativity varies it goes up as we increase in size. So water is a polar molecule because they make polar covalent bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen. So H2O means there are two H's and one O. Ignore these P's now for now. And in a water molecule, the oxygen is a lot more electronegative. Right? Oxygen is a lot more electronegative. So even though it's sharing electrons with hydrogen, with two hydrogens here, the electrons spend a lot more time around the oxygen than around either of these hydrogens. Therefore, water is a polar molecule. Electrons are unequally shared amongst this molecule because they spend a lot more time around the oxygen, because oxygen is more electronegative. Compare that to methane. Carbon with 4 hydrogens, right? That's what methane is. And carbon and hydrogen have very similar electronegativities. Neither carbon nor hydrogen really cares more than the other for electrons. So therefore, while they're sharing these pairs of electrons, neither atom is pulling harder than the other, and all the electrons are shared equally among the methane. So methane is a non-polar molecule. This is very important to understand. Polar molecules have unequal sharing of electrons. Non-polar molecules have equal sharing of electrons. And like I mentioned, the periodic table arranges atoms by electronegativity. You can see as we go from left to right, we increase in electronegativity. So this is the right, the most electronegative are these halogens, these elements that are so close to being very stable, like these guys over here. But fluoride and chloride have 7 valence electrons. They're very, very greedy for one more electron. So that means they're very electronegative. So we said carbon and hydrogen and methane had very similar electronegativities. You don't have to know these values, but these are relative values of like 2.2 and 2.6. Since carbon and hydrogen don't have very big differences in electronegativity, neither atom will pull on electrons more strongly than the other in methane. So this is a non-polar molecule. Methane is held together by non-polar covalent bonds because that's what happens when the two atoms, like carbon and hydrogen, have similar electronegativities. So this is one non-polar covalent bond, this is one non-polar covalent bond, this is one non-polar covalent bond, and this is one non-polar covalent bond. Compare that to water now, because the oxygen has a much higher electronegativity than the hydrogen in water. So oxygen will attract electrons a lot more strongly than the hydrogen atoms. So that means the bonds between hydrogen and oxygen are polar. Specifically, the oxygen will hold on to those electrons that are being shared. Right, they're both sharing these two electrons, but these two electrons will spend a lot more time around oxygen than the hydrogen. Because there's this unequal sharing of electrons, this can create a partial charge on some of the atoms in a molecule. So remember, oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen. That means it'll pull on those electrons a lot more tightly. That gives oxygen a slightly negative charge. It's not negatively charged because it still has the same amount of electrons that it's always supposed to have. However, the electrons spend a lot more time, right? They spend a lot more time closer to the oxygen than to the hydrogens. So we could say the oxygen atom has a slightly negative charge. And that's shown by this little delta minus charge. Since electrons spend less time near the hydrogens have a slight positive charge. So this symbol represents the partial positive charge. So this means within one water molecule, the oxygen is partially negative charged, and the hydrogens are slightly positively charged. Water is thus a polar molecule because it has unequal sharing of electrons. So if that's not clear, I would rewind and review. Because polarity in water helps explain hydrogen bonds, which is the last type of bond we're going to talk about. And hydrogen bonds are what explain why water sticks closely to each other. So water molecules stick very tightly to each other because of hydrogen bonds. So the slight positive charge on this hydrogen atom of one water molecule attracts the slight negative charge on a neighboring watering molecule, right? So this is an oxygen of a separate water molecule. And this dashed line represents the very weak interaction between this positive hydrogen, or I should say this partially positive hydrogen, and this partially negative oxygen. This is a hydrogen bond. So a hydrogen bond is a weak interaction between a slightly positive hydrogen atom and a slightly negative atom. That slightly negative atom is usually an oxygen or a nitrogen in biology. And these can be intramolecular, meaning within one molecule there can be hydrogen bonds, or as in the example we saw on the slide before, intermolecular, right? Different water molecules interacting with each other. And a single hydrogen bond is weak, but many together are very strong. So this is an example of one water molecule drawn out with the electrons being shown. This is called a ball and stick model, an oxygen with two hydrogens. And this shows the angle, the 104.5 degree angle between the two hydrogens. And that's dictated by the electrons and how they repel each other. And this shows the space filling model of the three atoms that make up a water molecule. And this also shows the positive, the partial positive charge on the hydrogens and the partial negative charge on the oxygen. And here you can see the intermolecular reaction, the intermolecular forces that hold different water molecules together. So this water is in a network with all other water molecules, and they're attracted by hydrogen bonds. And again, one hydrogen bond is weak, but many together is very strong. So this is a short video on hydrogen bonds. Watch this together. Great. So there's a way to predict which type of bonds that two atoms will make. And you don't have to memorize this. I just want you to understand the concept. But two elements with very different electronegativities will likely form ionic bonds. That's the case with sodium and chlorine. Very large difference in electronegativity explains why they make an ionic bond. Two elements with similar electronegativities will form nonpolar covalent bonds. That example is like methane. The hydrogen and the carbon of methane both have similar electronegativities. Neither wants electrons that much more than the other, so they're going to share very equally. Two elements with moderately different electronegativities will likely form polar covalent bonds. So that's the example of water. So oxygen is a lot more electronegative than hydrogen, so they can still share, but the oxygen will pull more tightly, more strongly, and that will make water a polar molecule, and this bond a polar covalent bond. So try to pause here and see if you could answer this question. And the answer is D. And here's a summary of the four types of bonds we just discussed. So we'll talk next about the properties of water. And I'd like you to read in the book in more detail of the properties of water, and the book gives you several applied examples. I'm going to go through it briefly now. So several properties of water make it conducive to living organisms. And without water being so special in its molecular properties, life might have never been in existence. So water has a high heat of vaporization. And that means that hydrogen bonds must be broken in order for water to evaporate. So water stays as a liquid very efficiently. You need to put in a lot of energy in order to break all those hydrogen bonds and turn liquid water into water vapor, which is gas. But this actually comes in handy when bodies of organisms need to cool down. So we can use the heat of our body to evaporate water, like sweat, and that causes a cooling effect on our bodies. So the high heat of vaporization is a very good thing for multiple reasons. Water has a high specific heat. That basically means that the temperature of water rises very slowly and falls very slowly. And this is important for organisms to maintain homeostasis. We don't want organisms to have large fluctuations in temperature. And since organisms are largely water, we want water to have that buffering capacity, right? Water holds onto its heat, and the temperature falls more slowly than that of other liquids. And again, this is a very important property not only for aquatic organisms, but for all of life, because living things are made of water. Water molecules can also cling together because of hydrogen bonding. And these properties are called cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion explains how two water molecules stick to each other. So a water molecule sticking to another water molecule. Adhesion talks about two different molecules clinging together. So in this case, it's a water molecule sticking to something else. And a good example of cohesion and adhesion can be seen in this water movement in this tree. So the roots of the tree are going to pull up water, and by cohesion, so let's start by the leaves. So the leaves have water, and the water is going to evaporate out of the leaves, and that's going to cause this pulling of water from the roots. So as water leaves, each water molecule grabs onto another water molecule by cohesion. Remember, that's by hydrogen bonds. So this is a hydrogen that's weakly attracted to this oxygen. This is a hydrogen to this oxygen, and vice versa. So as water molecules evaporate, they pull on other water molecules from the roots by cohesion. And also, these water molecules adhere to the water conducting cells of the roots and the xylem, those special roots, the special types of cells that transfer water. They're kind of sticky. So hydrogen bonds also form between water molecules and the cells that bring the water up the roots to the leaves again. So again, water is delivered through plants by cohesion and adhesion. And the book explains that in figure 2.11. Water is also a very good solvent due to its polarity. This means that polar substances dissolve readily in water. So polar substances dissolve well in polar substances. Hydrophilic molecules are all polar, and thus they dissolve in water. And let's think of what that word hydrophilic means. Hydro means water, philic means loving. Right? Philosophy is a love of learning. So phil, like P-H-I-L, is love. So hydrophilic molecules love water. Hydrophilic means polar. They're interchangeable. So polar substances and hydrophilic substances dissolve well in water because they can make hydrogen bonds with water. Hydrophobic molecules, water-fearing molecules, do not dissolve in water because they cannot make hydrogen bonds with water. So while salt and soap and sugar can dissolve in water and make hydrogen bonds, those are hydrophiles. Hydrophobes like oil and wax cannot make hydrogen bonds with water. A solution contains dissolved substances called solutes in a solvent. So this is just some terminology. So if I wanted to make a sugar solution, the sugar would be my solute, that's the solid usually, that gets dissolved in my solvent, which is water in this case. And when I dissolve them together, that makes our solution. And if a solute is soluble, it will dissolve well in the solvent. So you could pause here and review this terminology and make sure this makes sense. So you should understand solution, solute, solvent, and soluble. So water is a polar solvent, right? And like we said before, hydrophilic substances like salt dissolve well in water because it's polar. And you can see here specifically now how the sodium and the chloride ions separate in a salt solution. So if you take salt and dissolve it in water, what's happening is the ionic bonds that once held sodium and chloride together is being broken, and the water molecules are going to shield the ions separately. And since chlorine, or I should say chloride, is negatively charged, the partially positive hydrogens of the water will face it, and then the opposite will happen of this positively charged sodium ion, right? So the negatively charged oxygens will be facing this sodium ion. So that's what happens when you dissolve salt in water. Another property of water is that ice is less dense than liquid water. And it's important to know that ice floats for a reason. And if ice were to sink, that would create a huge problem for aquatic organisms. So in the winter, the oceans would freeze from the bottom up, and it would force all the sea life to be, higher up and higher up, closer to the surface. So it's good that ice floats. That's very good for wildlife. And what explains it is the hydrogen bonds. So normally in liquid water, there are hydrogen bonds are between much closer water molecules. And they're kind of always being made and being broken in liquid form. Once water is frozen as ice, the hydrogen bonds expand between the water molecules and they stay in place. And because they spread out, the water molecules become more rigid, but it also expands. And that explains why if you put a can of soda in the freezer, it'll explode. because all the hydrogen bonds in the water of this soda expand at cooler temperatures, below 0 degrees Celsius, and that expansion will cause the aluminum can to explode. So in its pure state, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, but by using salt, you can actually lower that freezing point. So you can make it so that the water does not freeze at 0 degrees, and it would need to be even colder for water to freeze. How does this happen? So try to make a hypothesis and pause here and think about how salt can help with freezing roads in the winter. Right, so ions like salt prevent water from freezing, because when salts like sodium chloride or calcium chloride is added to ice, the ionic bonds between the salts are broken, so sodium separates from the chlorine, and those ions interrupt the hydrogen bonds between water molecules and the ice crystals. So you're taking salt and you're interrupting all the hydrogen bonds in the ice crystals, and that will cause the ice to melt, and that's why we salt our roads in the winter. So the ice crystals can lose their structure and melt and make it safer for us to drive. So we'll finally talk about acids and bases. So it's a good time to pause here. So let's start by talking about pH. You might have heard the word pH before, and all that pH means, it's the measure of the hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. So a hydrogen ion is H+. If you recall, hydrogen is only a mass of 1, the atomic number. So that means it only has 1 proton. It has no neutrons. So I want you to actually take this time to recognize that a hydrogen ion, H+, is the same thing as just a proton. Because a hydrogen atom is a proton and an electron. And if you lose the electron, what do you have left? Just the proton. So when you see H+, that's the same thing as saying a proton. It's a little tricky, but write that down and that will come up in subsequent chapters. So pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration, that's what the H is, in a solution. So water, H2O, contains an equal number of H+ ions and hydroxide ions, OH-. So normally water is H2O, but there's a small amount of ions that dissociate. So when water ionizes, it releases an equal number of H+ and OH-. Normally, the actual number of water molecules that dissociate is 1 × 10⁻⁷ moles per liter. You don't really have to understand what moles means in a biology class yet. It's just a constant. It's a way to measure amount. This is a very small number, right? This is 0.00. This is with 6 zeros. So it's 0.0000001, right? 1 × 10⁻⁷. That's how little H+ there is in neutral water. Acids are substances that release more hydrogen ions when they dissociate in water. So if you add an acid to water, the number of H+ is going to go up. You're going to have more H+. Bases are substances that release OH- when dissociated in water. And those OH- absorb H+. And a basic substance is also called an alkaline, just to have that in the back of your mind. So the pH scale is used to indicate the acidity or the alkalinity of a solution. It's telling you how much H+ ions are there in a solution relative to neutral water. So the values range from 0 to 14, and 7 represents neutral water. And that number 7 comes from, if you go back here, remember that that's the exponent. It's the negative exponent of it's 1 times 10 to the negative 7 moles of H plus. So a pH of 7 is neutral because that means there's an equal number. There's 1 times 10 to the negative 7 moles of H plus and 1 times 10 to the negative 7 moles of OH minus in liquid water, neutral, pure water. So that's the arbitrary, that's number of pH 7 is neutral. If you have a number that's less than 7, that means you are acidic. So a pH of 0 is the most acidic you can get. So a pH of 0.5, we'll say. So the lower the value, the more acidic. So again, it's a little confusing. And I can explain this. I hope it doesn't confuse you, but it's a negative exponent. So if you were to look at this, if you were to do 1 times 10 to the negative 3, that's a much bigger number than 10 to the negative 7. So a pH of 3 represents more H+. It's more acidic, right? So the higher the exponent, the fewer H pluses, and the more basic a solution is. And again, if you haven't read this in the book, this might be confusing on the first time reading this. So 0 to 7 is acidic, 7 is neutral, greater than 7 to 14 is basic or alkaline. And confusingly, each unit of pH is a log 10 difference. It's a 10-fold difference. So it's logarithmic scale. So that means each unit change in pH represents a 10-fold change in H plus concentration. So as we move up the scale from 0 to 14, each unit is 10 times more basic than the previous unit. So for example, a pH of 4 is 10 times as acidic as a pH of 5. pH of 5 is 10 times as acidic as pH of 6. pH of 6 is 10 times acidic as a pH of 7. So how much more acidic is a pH of 4 than a pH of 6? So think about that. It's 10 times 10. So it's 100. So a pH of 4 is 100 times more acidic than a pH of 6. A solution of pH 6 is 100 times more basic than a solution of pH 4. Right? A pH of 10 is 100 times more basic than a pH of 8. And another trick that might confuse you is I'm trying to think of if it's even worth explaining it here. You can subtract the exponents. So a pH of 10, right? It's 10 minus 8 is 2. So that represents it's going to be a factor. It's going to be 10 to the second power, or 100 times difference. So you can look at the values of the pH values, and that's going to be the difference. It's going to be the exponent value on the base of 10. That will give you the fold change in H plus concentration. So for example, if I asked you how much more acidic is pH 5 to pH 1, right? You're going to know it's going to be 10, since 5 minus 1 is 4, you're going to say it's going to be a 10 to the 4 difference, which is 10,000 times difference. So this is a very informative little picture that shows the pH scale. And here at pure water and tears, we have a neutral pH of 7. So there's equal red, which is H plus, and equal OH minus, which is in blue. As we go toward more acid, we're seeing more and more of this H plus. So on the very, very strong acid scale, we have HCl. And HCl is a very strong acid because it fully dissociates in water. HCl is a strong acid that almost completely dissociates into H plus and Cl minus. And here, as we go up, these are weaker acids. So like soda and beer, vinegar, those are weaker acids. Then you have like rainwater is slightly acidic due to the carbon dioxide in the environment and pollution. We could talk more about that at a different time. Milk is slightly acidic. And then we have 7. So now, as we're going from 7 to 14, we're going to see an increase in the OH minus. So here we have egg whites, baking soda is an acid, some cleaning products like ammonia and oven cleaner are very basic. And sodium hydroxide is a very strong base because it almost fully dissociates into Na and OH minus in solution. So pause here and answer the question. So the answer is A. And a buffer is a substance that keeps pH within normal limits. So a buffer is something that can either take an H plus if needed, or it can give away an H plus if needed. And what word describes the biological balance that buffers would help provide for living organisms? Right, the answer is homeostasis. Right, so we need to keep homeostasis of pH. We need to have a balance of pH inside of our blood, for example. And we have buffers in our blood that can either take an H plus if there's too much H plus in our blood, or it can donate an H plus if we need more in our blood. So we have a built-in buffer system called the bicarbonate buffer system that helps prevent pH changes in blood. And carbonic acid can dissociate and or reform to help reduce drastic changes in pH as we metabolize things. So normally we need our blood to be between 7.35 and 7.45 all the time. If you have a pH of lower than 7.35, that's called acidosis. If it's lower than 7, you die. If it's higher than 7.5, it's called alkalosis, right? Like alkaline. And the body tries to compensate for that by breathing mechanisms to try to get rid of excess CO2 if the blood is too acidic. But sometimes you might have to go to the hospital for some intensive care if your blood gets out of homeostasis, if your blood is out of this biological balance. So we normally avoid acidosis and alkalosis because we have built-in buffer systems in our blood that can either accept H plus if our blood is too acidic or give us more H plus if our blood is too basic. So which of the following bonds are the weakest? Pause here. The answer is C, hydrogen bonds. So pause here. The answer is D, alkaline and basic. True or false? And try to switch the underlined word to make it true. So in the underlined statement, so in a water molecule, polar covalent bonds connect 2 hydrogen atoms to an oxygen atom. The underlined word, is that true or false? That is true. So do the same one here and pause here, please. So the answer is false. It's isotopes. They're not ions, they're isotopes. So that's it for chapter 2. Complete the lecture review 2 on Connect. And the upcoming quiz 2, covers not only this chapter, but also chapter 3. So it is very important to study very hard. I would say quiz 2 probably has more information than any of the quizzes in the near future. So please take the time to study very hard for quiz 2. And I will see you next time for chapter 3 when we talk about biomolecules.